Hey there, everyone, and thank you for joining me on this episode, number 111 of the Pursuit of Happiness podcast. And yeah, you're in for a ride. It's about to get really personal, very vulnerable, but I made that promise in episode one. I was going to be honest and personal throughout this entire experience, and we had just gotten started 3 years into this. But you all deserve a little look behind the scenes of why this started, where the name Pursuit of Happiness came from, how it's going so far. So yeah, buckle up, because here we go. This is episode 111 with myself and the story behind the podcast. Welcome to the Pursuit of Happiness podcast. I am your host, Ryan McGuire. And if you are in pursuit of your own happiness, this is the podcast for you. Join me along my own journey in finding happiness as I cover topics such as health, wellness, mindset, travel, adventure, dating, relationships, and so much more as I interview some of the most passionate and successful people in the world and ask them the questions that we all want to know on how they found their happiness. And thank you all for joining me on this rather personal episode behind the podcast and how it all started. I've been meaning to do this episode for quite some time now. I guess I've been delaying, you could say. As I just mentioned, it is pretty personal, and I kind of want to introduce to everybody how this all started, where the concept came from, so you get a little behind the scenes look at who I am and the growth of this podcast for almost 3 years now. I cannot believe I'm saying that. So for all of you who have been on this journey with me throughout all of these episodes, I am forever thankful and grateful. And for all of you who are joining me on this pursuit, welcome. And you're missing out. You've been missing out for a few years. I am so proud of all of my episodes, a lot of my guests. They're absolutely incredible. And I will go ahead and say there are many, many more great ones to come. I am so excited at the momentum this podcast is building. This is something that I literally have built from scratch, as you're about to find out. So when this succeeds, I don't know, there's a lot more pride that comes with it. I am just so proud of myself for starting this and where this podcast is going. And I have a feeling I can't even see the limit from here. I'm so excited about that. And thank you for all of you who have listened, all of you who have subscribed, and all of you who follow me at the Pursuit of Happiness podcast on Instagram. Like I said, I will forever be thankful. So thank you so much. And also, please refer this to friends and family. Let's get this out to even more people because, as I just mentioned, more great episodes on the way with some amazing advice, tips, and tricks on how to make your life happier and chase your dreams. But as I just mentioned, this episode is to get a look behind the scenes on how and why this podcast started. Now, I've been a listener for podcasts for quite some time. You name it. Joe Rogan, Ed Milet, Lewis Howes, Matthew Huberman, and you name it. I've probably listened to it. I loved my podcast. And it always made me, just being a creative person, always made me want to start my own, but I had just no clue where to begin. And I guess you can say probably had somewhat of an imposter syndrome, like who even knows who I am? Why would anybody say yes to talk to me? I don't even know how to really interview people. I know how to have conversations, but I don't really know how to interview people and make it interesting for other people. I will say that's the number one skill along the way that I've learned that I am so proud of, is how to interview people and how to guide a conversation. It's definitely helped me in so many different areas of life, but that's neither here nor there. But I finally got the courage to start, I will say, a podcast. I didn't have a name for it yet, but I got the courage to start this podcast back in 2020 when a lot of people probably started to branch out and try new and different things because of COVID, because of the lockdowns. And at the time, I was very single and I had a lot of extra time on my hands. And, I kind of stopped making the excuse of not being able to produce my podcast and be creative. I had all the time in the world. There was no reason I could not learn and go ahead and throw myself into this and put myself out there. And if it didn't do well, so be it. I tried. I can never blame myself for trying. So yeah, it was 2020. We were all locked down. I needed something to do and throw my passion into. And this podcast was just a great outlet for that. Now, I will say I was really having a hard time, paralysis by analysis, on what the hell I should name this. I will say one of the biggest issues I was having at the time of 2020, as I just mentioned, I was very single. Dating was incredibly difficult. I know it still is for many people. Imagine dating during COVID when you're basically locked down. You can't meet people. When you do meet people, everyone has a mask on. Everyone's like hesitant to be around you. They don't even know if you're sick. You don't know who's vaccinated. There's so many rumors and misconceptions going around about COVID, and we don't really know what it is. So here I am thinking, well, I'm 37 years old. Like, Jesus, like, I'm going to be single forever. Like, dating was hard enough, let alone during a pandemic. How in the world am I going to meet anybody? And my frustration was real. I was having a hard time with online dating. Meeting people in person wasn't going really well. And the frustration was real. I seriously saw no end in sight for all the issues I was having with dating and relationships. So if you go back, I'm not sure if I even recommend doing this, but episode 1, a lot of times I replay in my head. I haven't listened to it in a long time, but I'm well aware a lot of what I talked about and this why I started this podcast was for dating and relationships, and talk about the hardships and have dating experts on, which I actually have. I love those conversations. And yeah, it was an outlet for my frustrations. And go figure, I found the woman that I married just a few months into this because of this podcast. Go figure. This podcast has just been a blessing in so many ways. But on episode 1, I promised myself and my audience that I would be vulnerable and honest and put myself out there. And that is something I will always hold true to this podcast, especially for this episode. So yeah, dating, a big pain in the ass. And then 2020 hit and it became even worse. So as I said, super frustrated with that aspect of life. And this is also where I get super personal that I haven't talked about much. I've hinted on a few episodes, especially some with my mental health and therapist guests. Late 2019 or so, my parents announced that they were getting divorced. And I will go ahead and say that was more one-sided, with my father ending the marriage, which in of itself is pretty difficult to take in and kind of gather. And what made it even worse was how my mother and my sister reacted to that news. And in all honesty, 3 years later, still react to that. And I basically, for months and months and months and up into this day, and that's a serious statement, I'm still very much being put in the middle of this divorce. As much as it's basically old news now, it's still very fresh. A lot of the aftershocks and aftermath of my parents getting divorced, it's still a major frustration in my life. Not because of necessarily me having resentment against like either of them or the situation or how it turned out. Unfortunately, I'm somewhat of a realist and know that a rather large part of marriages and relationships, they end up in breakups and divorces. And, growing up, you don't necessarily think your parents are going to be part of that. But the older I got, the more I noticed that, they weren't necessarily the happiest of couples. And Dad, I know you listen to this. I know you know what I'm talking about. I appreciate you letting me talk about this. But yeah, it was and is extremely, extremely frustrating to constantly be getting phone calls and text messages being brought into the middle of this, asking to relay messages, being told behind the scenes what's being said and the arguments and the fights. And honestly, I was just trying to build a happier life for myself. And it is incredibly difficult to do when you consistently feel like you're being pulled backwards, especially into a situation and into drama that you just don't really want anything to do with. I think both of my parents can be happy on their own, but my mother seems to have a really hard time believing that and is just not really ready to give up the idea of what our family was, our nucleus. And I also do have a sister who I believe is on that same exact wavelength. And honestly, it's made my life extremely difficult at times. And you can tell I'm kind of talking slow, probably breathing a little heavy at this moment. Like I'm not someone that deals with anxiety very often, but this situation has given me so much anxiety. The communication has just been absolutely terrible. I've had way more blow-ups with my parents than I've ever wanted. I really just want both of them to be happy, and I will be absolutely okay with that. As I said, my parents getting divorced wasn't something I envisioned, but it is what it is. They both need to do what's best for them. And yeah, it's been an incredibly difficult situation. I appreciate all of you for listening to this. There's probably people that can relate to this. So shoot me a message, say, hey, I heard this. I completely understand where you're coming from, because it's been over 3 years now and I'm still dealing with this. It's not gotten a whole lot better, in all honesty. And I'm actually going to therapy for this and learning how to deal with the situation and put up boundaries. And I've been absolutely terrible at doing that so far, because it is family, right? You get to choose your friends. You can cut negative people out of your life, but family is a little difficult. It's a little different. You can't just necessarily do that. I mean, you can. I just don't really have the heart to do that. But we'll see how these next few months to year even goes. I hope it gets better. But with that said, with this going on and COVID happening and everybody being depressed and scared and fearful, and you're seeing a lot of death on TV, I was just thinking, man, like, this is really kind of like a depressing time. Everyone's like really sad and scared. And here I am trying to build just like a happy life. And I woke up one morning with the Kid Cudi song, which is my intro, The Pursuit of Happiness, in my head. I don't know why it was in my head. I would say within a minute or two, I was like, The Pursuit of Happiness. This is the name of my podcast, because it is truly what I'm going for. This is my journey. And I invite all of you to follow me on my journey. And I know you're all on your own journey to be happy as well. So when I interview these people, or I have conversations, these solo conversations, just like I'm doing now, it is for you to take bits and pieces of advice or learning from someone else's path or journey and how they found happiness and try to apply that to your life. It's incredible how many times I've been able to do that, or just take these little quotes or sayings or parts of these conversations and apply it to my life. And it's just made my life exponentially better. It's been a blessing. I hope you've been able to take something away from a lot of these conversations. I've had, as I just mentioned, mental health coaches and therapists on, which help us deal with some really tough times. I've had travelers and adventure seekers on, which has definitely assisted me in kind of like the YOLO mentality. You only live once. Are you really happy with where you are now? And if you're not, it's okay to take a leap of faith and go after what your dreams are and where you want to be. And I've just had so many conversations, health and fitness, huge part of my life, huge part of feeling good, looking good, and being happy with that, being confident. So all of these episodes, I know I'm very well aware I don't necessarily have like a target subject or two, but I think that makes my podcast rather unique. I love it. It's kind of like a deck of cards for my audience. They don't know what's going to come next, but I do promise you it's a positive conversation. There's something you can take from it. And just to go back to 2020 again, if I'm being honest and vulnerable here. So we're in the middle of when COVID started, which many of you know was pretty terrible. And being caught in the middle of my parents' issue and my sister not really helping a whole lot, honestly. And then on top of that, you've probably heard me mention in many of my episodes, I've done episodes based purely around this, is my best friend Koda, who was my husky that I got back in 2005. She was my best friend through everything. She moved from New York to Connecticut with me when I knew nobody. And after a couple of years, we moved down to North Carolina. And yeah, she was just honestly my best friend. There was no me without Koda. There was no Koda without me. And, I think something that we've all mostly had to deal with at some point or another is grieving and tragedy and the loss of someone or something that we've loved. And I've had to do that a few times with some family members, but more so like grandparents. I had an uncle pass away when I was younger. I would say for the most part, nothing super unexpected. It's one of those kind of like, it's a circle of life, and it's incredibly hard to deal with. Everyone grieves different. But when I started to gradually lose my dog after 15 and a half years, it's still honestly difficult for me to talk about today. There was nothing that hit me harder. There's nothing that could hit me harder than that. I still do get emotional at times thinking about her, talking about her. Man, I was attached. And for those people who are not pet people listening to this, or dog people, maybe you won't understand. But if you do have a dog, you're an animal person, you're a pet person, you probably completely understand where I'm coming from. It is literally your best friend. That animal, that pet, relied on me every single day, and I relied on her every day to bring me happiness. Whether I was having a crummy day, I'd still have a great time with her, and I'd take her for walks. She got me out of the house every day. She made me laugh every day. I also wanted a husky for probably about almost 20 years before I got her, and that's an honest statement. My mom was not one for dogs. She definitely has a fear of dogs, so I had to wait till I graduated college and finally got her. even though I actually lived at home with my mom, who grew to absolutely love her, of course, right? Of course, that's how it always turns out. But I wanted Koda for 2 decades and finally got her. My attachment was real. Yeah, I mean, I can look back now and say 15 and a half years, like, sign me up for that. I'm pretty sure, we have 3 dogs in the house right now. Sign me up for 15 and a half years. But it doesn't really make that any easier, whether it's 5, 10, 15 years, when you lose your best friend and everything that you did every day was based around her schedule and when you're waking up and when you're going for a walk and when you're feeding her and when you have to leave work to come take her out and then you have to leave a party. You can't have a sleepover because I gotta go take my dog out. That was just my life for 15 years. And yeah, when that gets just literally ripped away from you, she passed away in October of 2020. We were having some major health issues for the last few months. It turns out that she was anemic, and I had never tried so hard in my life to hang on and do everything possible to help her. I had done so much research on supplements and how I can get her iron and what foods have the most iron. And you can go buy sardines, and sardines have great iron for dogs. And brought her to the vet multiple times, got everything checked and checked twice. And I did everything I possibly could. And to say goodbye was the hardest thing I've ever had to do. That is not an understatement. That's the truth. That is the hardest thing I've ever had to do. I have a hard time putting myself mentally back in that place. Was not ready for it. Brought her to the vet thinking that they would send me home with her, and that was not the case. So leaving the vet without her was the worst thing I could ever imagine. And unfortunately, it's something you kind of sign up for when you get a pet and you bring that pet in your life. You're signing up for years and years and years of happiness and memories and laughing. And then that moment comes, and it's incredibly difficult. It is incredibly difficult. I don't necessarily want to be a downer in this episode. I don't want to keep going down that road way too far here, but just trying to give you kind of like a backstory of 2020 and how this podcast started. So as you can tell, COVID going crazy. Lockdowns took away everything, a lot of what we love to do, our interactions, being single. Dating was incredibly difficult. Relations just weren't even on the table. And then my parents' relationship was completely obliterated and just turned my life upside down, and dealing with the family drama just made things exponentially worse. And then obviously Koda and that whole situation, let's just say, I know 2020 was a very difficult year for many people, including myself, because the things closest to me were just not going the way I had hoped. And, I had really, really tried to focus on finding happiness and doing everything I could. And with traveling and work has been successful. It's like I'm trying to do everything I possibly can, but just some things were out of my control, and it bothered me so much. I could not control those things, and they were going backwards when everything I could control was going forward. So it was somewhat of a helpless situation, which is another reason that I wanted to name this podcast The Pursuit of Happiness, because I needed conversations with other people that were going to bring me up in life and point me in the right direction and hold me accountable to do things that were going to make me better, than continue to have conversations with people that brought me down, that were negative, and did not do anything for me but put me into a really bad place. I can't tell you how excited, honestly, still to this day, when I reach out to people and they say yes to be a guest on my podcast, I still get excited. 3 years later, I'm still super pumped when someone says, yep, I'll be on. I see him schedule. That juice and that energy just keeps me going. I absolutely love it. And yeah, it started almost 3 years ago now. As I said, I really just wanted to have productive conversations with people that were finding their happiness or had information they can give to me and to you to help us on our journey of finding happiness. And I will say overall, it's worked. It really has worked. As I just mentioned, I'm still really dealing with some stuff with the whole family issues. Thankfully, this podcast and my conversations have really helped mature me. And as I mentioned just previously, I actually found my wife because of this podcast, because I told my buddy Brian I would sign up for a dating profile with him. This was episode, I think it was 11. It was like 10 or 11. And the fact that I found my wife because of this podcast still just kind of blows me away. This just whole podcast, it was like a self-starter idea, and look where it's brought me in life, and the connections I've made has been absolutely incredible. I have maintained pretty much a friendship with most people I've had on my podcast. That's why I get a lot of return guests. It's like, hey, I haven't talked to you in a while. There's a few other subjects I really want to talk to you about. Come on back, and they're happy to do it. It's been absolutely incredible. And being a fan of podcasts and listening to other conversations, obviously there's such a great influence on me. I've learned how to interview people better, but also with just the way that I do it. Still learning. I still listen to my episodes. I re-listen. I try to take notes, try to get better. But yeah, I've left podcasts and listening to podcasts sometimes still wanting to know more, or still wishing that people went down specific avenues with specific guests to learn more about them in certain areas. So basically I thought to myself, okay, well, if I am able to get some of these guests on my podcast, I'm able to control the conversation and dive deep in the areas that I'm genuinely interested in. I can't be the only one who's interested in this. Case in point, when I've had a couple Olympians on my podcast, I really want to know what their training looks like. How in the world are you such an elite athlete? Like, when are you going to bed? How hard are you training? When are you training? What are you doing to train? What are you eating? What are you drinking? I want to know all of this. And a lot of times, like, these people have these conversations, and they're great and all, but I want to go behind the scenes, and I want to know all of these things so I can literally apply this to my life. If I know an Olympian is, let's just say, working out at 7 a.m. with a specific protein shake afterwards, and they're eating such and such for dinner, well, guess what? I'm going to start probably incorporating that into my daily routine, with the hopes that information like that affects your life and gets you into good habits as well. So if you're listening to this and there is a guest you think would be great for this podcast, please let me know. And if there are questions you're really curious about, shoot me a message. The only way to find out is to ask. And so this podcast gives me, one, a platform to reach out and say hi to people I never in a million years would have DM'd or emailed. It's just giving me a reason to. It's literally a platform to say, hey, my name is so-and-so. I would love to talk to you for an hour or two. And most people say yes, and it's absolutely incredible. And it's a way to ask the questions I really want to know. And this has been one of the best, biggest leaps of life I have ever taken. And I'm not going to stop. This is a passion of mine. And for all of my guests who have said yes and who have been on my podcast, I am truly appreciative, more than you know. It means so much. Like I said in the beginning, this is a podcast that came just from my mind. I made a list in my notepad on my phone of a bunch of subjects I would love to know more about, and I just started reaching out to experts in those areas, and look what it's turned into. This is episode 111 I cannot believe I am in triple digits. And for everybody that has listened to 1 episode, 2 episodes, 5, 10, 20, whatever it is, thank you. I hope my podcast and my conversations have brought something to your life, whether it's entertainment or whether it's something that you can apply to your life or your family's life or your friends to make it even the smallest amount better. That's what this is all about. It's about making your life better. You can follow me on my pursuit of happiness, and I hope it affects you in a positive way along your pursuit of happiness, because that is all we want in life, is to follow what makes us happy, what gives us juice in the morning, what gives us passion and energy. And I will continue to follow that for as long as I live. And I invite you to continue following me along this journey, and let's do this together. So thanks again for listening to this episode. And as I mentioned, I promise there are more amazing episodes of the Pursuit of Happiness podcast to come with some absolutely incredible guests. I am so excited. But until then, I'll catch you next time on the Pursuit of Happiness podcast.